Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the morning plenary keynote session at the BESTEMM conference. We'll continue our session following Dr. Kong's talk with another talk from a brilliant member of our CBSN network, Dr. Evelyn Asiedu. Dr. Asiedu's talk is sponsored by the University of Toronto Scarborough, which is also our host institution. Dr. Evelyn Asiedu is the second daughter of immigrants from Ghana, Africa. She was born in Toronto, but grew up in the neighboring town of Brampton, Ontario, located on treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In 2013, Dr. Asiedu received her Honours Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Western University, and she defended her PhD thesis in Analytical Environmental Toxicology in October 2020 at the University of Alberta. Dr. Asiedu completed her first postdoctoral research fellow with Environment and Climate Change Canada in June 2021, and the following month, she started in her new role at Thompson Rivers University. As the EDI data analyst, Dr. Asiedu will contribute to the development of strategies which will identify and dismantle barriers to participation of all people on campus. Specifically, she aims to establish methods which create goals and systematically measure progress towards their achievement. Dr. Asiedu will be doing the work which she called for in Maclean's exactly 1 year prior. So I would now like to invite Dr. Asiedu to join me on the stage. Good morning.
Morning, Kim.
How are you today?
I'm okay. I must admit, I'm kind of nervous, which is a little bit different for me, but I'm really happy to be here.
There's no need to be nervous. You're going to be great. We're very excited to have you here. It feels extra special for me to have an early career, someone at a similar career level as me here. So I'm very excited to hear your talk. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, and to BESTEMM for allowing me to have this opportunity to talk to all of you. Of course, this is the first talk of this kind that I'll be doing, and the first conference of this kind for all of us. So it's a huge accomplishment. So I'd like to just start off by saying congratulations to the whole BESTEMM conference team, and I'll get right into it. So as Kim mentioned, my name is Dr. Evelyn Asiedu, and today my talk is called Known Unknowns: Evidence-Based Approaches to Mending the Leaky Pipeline of Black Scientists in Canada. So before I get started, I would like to say that I am currently in Kamloops, BC, and I'm an uninvited settler here in the unceded traditional lands of the Secwepemc Nation. And this university also is on the territory which extends to the Staten, Secwepemc, Newhook, Kakal, Métis, and other communities within these territories. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. And my hope and my goal is to allow my work to contribute to reconciliation for Indigenous peoples on this land and to build a more inclusive future for everyone. So before I moved to Kamloops, I actually was living in Edmonton. As you've all heard, I did my PhD at the University of Alberta, which is actually on Treaty 6 territory. So Edmonton doesn't actually look like this. This is in the mountains in Kananaskis in Alberta, where I spent a lot of my time when I wasn't studying, hiking and whatnot, and quite a beautiful place. But I made a transition in the last year to study beyond scientists, the sciences, to hopefully contribute to expanding our community in the sciences. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I just want to take a second to ask you all for some grace. This is the first type of talk that I'm giving in my new postdoc role. So we're going to start with a bit of science in my background, and then go into a little bit of history and kind of applications to how we can use evidence-based and scientific approaches to equity. So it's going to be a meandering talk, a little bit of a journey, but I hope you do enjoy it. And I hope that you're all a little bit patient with me, because it will be a little bit different than what I'm sure what you've all are used to in science conferences. So starting with my background, this will just be a review of my PhD work. I moved to Alberta to study the oil sands, of course, because that's where the natural resource is. And so to give you a little bit of context, the oil sands they look like this. So kind of a clumpy, thick and viscous mixture of oil sand, silt and clay. And in order to extract that ore from the ground, huge trucks are required. And so this is an example of one of those cat trucks. And it can be difficult to really conceptualize how big these trucks actually are. And so this is a picture of myself and a couple peers in the wheel of one such truck. So they're pretty huge, the size of a couple garages. And so the oil is very thick and viscous. And in order to get it up from the ground, there's a process which includes digging, driving across a mine site, crushing the ore, adding a caustic or basic slurry, and then finally extracting the oil from this viscous mixture. And so initially the water that comes from the land is natural, it's a natural source. And once it's mixed with this basic water, it becomes elevated in chemicals, which are known to be or shown to be toxic to the external environment. And so what I'm showing you here is a graph where on the y-axis, we're looking at the amount of synthetic crude oil produced over 2010 to 2018, and that's in red. And on the other y-axis is the amount of tailing surface water, which is being stored. So you can see directly that as the amount of synthetic crude produced from bitumen or oil sands extraction, the amount of tailings or water stored is also increasing. And that is because that water cannot be directly released into the environment. So the approximation is about, for each barrel of oil, about 2 to 3 barrels of fresh water from the Athabasca River in Alberta and its tributaries are used. And the subsequent water becomes elevated in a number of chemicals. One major group which has been focused on are the naphthenic acids. And so what I'm showing you here are just a few generic proposed structures for those toxic chemicals, with DBE standing for double bond equivalent, which is just either a ring or double bond. And so regulations, as I mentioned before, they're not, the oil sands process affected water, or OSPW, is not directly released into the environment. And so it's held in large tailings ponds, which looks just like this. And last figure I had was at about 1.5 billion cubic meters of oil sands process affected water, or OSPW, hereafter was being stored in this way, including some of the heavier tailings, which are found towards the bottom of such tailings ponds. And so regulations have it, and between industry and government, that this water has to be reclaimed prior to being returned to the environment. And so that is one such strategy to do this is known as the end-pit lake strategy, whereby initially the wastewater and tailings will be held in tailings ponds or end-pit lakes and allowed to separate until eventually you have clear water on top and heavier tailings towards the bottom, with a slow creation of biodiversity in the area, a natural creation of biodiversity in the area. And so ideally, we would start somewhere in, I think it started probably, the first pilot was in 2013. And so we're probably somewhere towards the middle when we're talking about the grand scheme of reclamation by the end-pit lake strategy. And about 30 end-pit lakes have been proposed, or at least had been proposed during the time of my PhD. And this map is showing you the area of where both oil sands mines are, where the natural river is, and where active mining is occurring. And so this picture here is, to the plain eye, untrained eye, it just looks like a natural pond or river, right? You might see a little tugboat in the front, some fireweed or blue natural flowers in the foreground. But when you look in the background, you start to notice something, some smokestacks. And what actually is the industry, which is right along that body of water, which is actually the first end pit lake. So this strategy is, in study right now, and Base Mine Lake, which was the topic of my PhD, at the time was the only end pit lake, but definitely the first end pit lake of the oil sands industry. And so to give you an idea of how big Base Mine Lake is, this was established in 2013. And so this is a schematic demonstrating exactly what we're talking about, where fluid fine tailings are like sand and silt, heavier tailings, about 200 million cubic meters towards the bottom, known to have kind of a yogurty structure. I'm sorry, I've probably ruined yogurt for many people this morning. And at the top, we have OSPW in freshwater, which is the liquid or the water, wastewater, which is produced about 40 million cubic meters towards the top. And this, the goal is to allow it to separate, as I mentioned before. And so to give you a true idea of how big that is, the bottom, you can think about it as an 8-story building where the top 2 floors are freshwater and the bottom 6 floors are this heavier waste tailing. So it's about an 8-story building with a surface of about 8 square kilometers. So BESTEMM Lake is huge. It's really huge, and not everyone knows that it exists, but indeed it does. And it's somewhat of a pilot in the area, in addition to other reclamation strategies. So the interesting thing is that the idea is eventually to return water, which is in tailings ponds, which is in end-pit lakes, to the natural ecosystem. So this is a futuristic depiction of what that might look like. And when you look at this this lake or and the surrounding area, you see that the natural watershed is in the background with both an inlet and an outlet going to the surrounding environment. So that's the plan, and that is why end-pit lakes have been known to be a little bit controversial, but ultimately this water can't be stored forever. And so scientists such as myself are looking into how effective the strategy actually is, especially considering because end-pit lakes have not been used in the oil sands industry. They've been used in other mining industries, but it is not yet fully understood if this will work for the oil sands. So in my PhD research, I had several questions, 3 of which were, what are the dissolved organics in BESTEMM Lake, and do they degrade? And if they degrade, how long do they take? And so just give you a little bit more of an understanding of what OSPW is, or oil sands post-affected water. This is an example of a vial containing such water, and you can see it's quite murky. It's hard to see through, and it shows how complex this mixture is. But it's also chemically complex, and that's why instruments such as this one, the Orbitrap mass spectrometer, are needed to decipher that complicated matrix. So in my PhD, I spent a lot of time with this instrument, the Orbitrap, and I learned a number of things. As any analytical chemist will tell you, sometimes things don't go your way. So I've learned things like negotiation, conflict resolution, and ultimately perseverance. Some of you will recognize this picture. It comes back up later. Might not only recognize it for the physical picture, but anybody who's done any kind of grad work knows that you have to persevere. So the dead eyes may be familiar to you. So getting back to the Orbitrap, why it's necessary is because of its high resolving power or high resolution. So what I've shown on this slide are 2 technical definitions of what resolution is, or resolving power. And on side A, we're looking at 2 peaks or 2 entities which have been detected in the instrument with a difference between those peaks. And so the resolving power of high resolution instruments like the Orbitrap presents it such that peaks which are very close together are able to be distinguished. So you have a very large number, or very large resolving power. And B, another definition is the full width of half max. That's a chemistry definition, not really important to the talk today, but it is with the power of the Orbitrap that we're able to look at mass spectra such as this. So a mass spectrum is essentially an output of the Orbitrap where each peak or each line represents a unique feature or species. And so this example I'm showing is from the output of one mode of mass spectrometry, which is a negative mode, which is used to detect acids. And so if we look in this narrow area between about 235 and 240, we begin to see clusters of peaks. And we can even go in a bit further within this green area within one nominal mass unit of 237, we see 3 unique peaks. And it's with the resolution of the Orbitrap that we're able to confidently or more confidently assign the formula of each of those peaks. And so that's essentially what the strategy was, or what the strategy is for many analytical chemists who study OSPW. And what I did in my PhD was to bin these chemicals by heteroatom. And so a heteroatom is just an atom that is not hydrogen or carbon. So that's, in this case, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen, which I'm showing. So what I did was take the samples and run them through the Orbitrap in the two modes, that's positive and negative mode, corresponding to acids and polar neutral types of chemicals, and eventually just categorizing them by the heteroatom, as I mentioned before. So by this strategy, those naphthenic acids, which I'd mentioned before, which are toxic, would be binned or categorized into the O2 negative category. And so that's probably more chemistry than any of you expected to have to hear today, but just giving you some evidence that, I did do chemistry for most of my life. And so in an ideal study design, what we would do would be to take the Enpit Lake, like Base Mine Lake, at its time of establishment in 2013, and review it and monitor it for 40 years to truly understand how degradation is happening, or if it's happening at all. But of course, we want to make estimations today. And so in order to do that, what I did in my PhD was to take proxies for current and future wastewater, where fresh wastewater came from tailings ponds, which receive a new input of OSPW, or oil sands process affected water, frequently, and Base Mine Lake, which does not receive any new wastewater, but is slightly diluted over time. And then finally, I also used samples of aged OSPW, which had come from a pilot project which was established in the late 80s and early 90s. And essentially by grouping these samples by age, making it an approximation or estimation of what happened with OSPW. And so there's a number of things that I studied, but I'll give you the Coles Notes version in showing you this diagram here, where we're looking at the relative contribution of these different chemical groups, focusing only on acidic type of chemicals. On the right-hand side, we're showing you the schematic of OSPW when it's fresh on the top, and then on the bottom, OSPW when it's aged. And so again, we're looking at 0 years to about 30 years for the time scale of the samples that I had. And what I noticed was that fresh OSPW had large amounts of the O2 chemical class, what's being shown in red, those are the naphthenic acids. But with time, we got more oxidation. So that just means that more chemical groups had more oxygens over time, which was fairly interesting. And so still trying to publish this. It's been at least a year since I've been out of my PhD, but I'm working on it. And I'm sure many of you know the joys of publication as a scientist. So the generalized approach that analytical chemists tend to use is a non-targeted approach. So we're looking at a mixture, which is being presented here in the schematic. You can imagine this as a vial with water or some sort of liquid matrix, and each of those little, what they look like hairs, I'm using those hairs to represent perhaps chemicals that we don't know about. And so we apply a set of restrictions to try and understand what those chemicals might be. So you can almost think about it as a haystack where each hay strand is an unknown. And so in the non-targeted analysis, we look at the haystack and run it through the mass spectrum. So apply a set of, as I said, restrictions and assess what do we see when we look at this mixture within, for example, 100 to 500 atomic mass units. And from there, we might begin to see a few chemicals with properties which we understand, and at the very least, a few chemicals with formula that we understand. And so this is what is referred to as a scan in mass spectrometry. And those red little lines are representing the perhaps chemicals which we now think we have some idea about. So what we might do is then put those chemicals through a database online, and that will give you an increased level of confidence or an increased level of certainty about what those chemicals might be. So that might be the structure, perhaps if there's any families related to it, and perhaps other uses or studies which have come across these chemicals already. And that can be useful. Non-targeted analysis has been increasingly popular in the last, I'd say, 20 years or so. And what I'm showing here is an article from MS Szymanski talking about identifying known unknown chemicals. So essentially, what is our approach as chemists when we are looking at a mixture of unique entities which perhaps no one has studied before? And so she then produced a follow-up publication which assigned kind of a general categorization of how we could become more and more confident as we identify what these chemicals are. So the lowest level of confidence being having an exact mass, and then perhaps having a formula, and then eventually as you add more and more characteristics to your chemicals, you can say, okay, for sure, this is what's in our mixture, and that allows us to do more things. And so here's the transition I'm going to try to make with you all. A former US Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, in talking about his strategy for understanding if there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He had responded to an interview or something about there are things that we know, and there are things we don't know, and there are things we don't know. And I think that that's a pretty good explanation, or at least thought process when we're thinking about how to study equity and inclusion, especially of Black scientists like yourselves in STEM and within Canada. And so in my role right now, I'm trying to expand the discussion of systematic approaches to understanding where we're at as Canadian scientists, and using the evidence to create targets to increase the number of Black professionals in STEM. So I made this transition in 2020. We don't need to go through all of the pains that we've all experienced in 2020, but it was a year of transition, obviously, for myself. I was, finishing the end of my PhD, so that was challenging. But while I was doing that, also recognizing that we were and still are at a time of reckoning, of reflecting of ourselves, of who we are as a human race, and who we are as citizens of Canada. And I, at the time, couldn't reconcile how much I'd given of myself to science and how much science had allowed me to be my best self. So that's the article. Essentially, what I wrote was to talk about the lack of information that we have as to what the experience of Black scientists, specifically Black women, is in Canada, and why that is specifically from an academic standpoint. And so that's what led me here to Kamloops. I am currently in the role of a postdoctoral fellowship in equity, diversity, inclusion analysis, and this image is of the campus. And so this is one of the only postdocs of its kind, to my knowledge. And it's been interesting, it's been challenging, but it's my personal goal to gain as much information as I can to expose the systemic issues of what we go through as Black scientists in a way that will help the next generation and current generation to accomplish the things that we know that we can do. And so I know nobody came here for a history lesson, but context is helpful. So I'm just going to quickly whiz by a few milestones that are important for us to understand why we're still here and why we're talking about inclusion of Black scientists, even though we've all known, I'm sure that it's been a problem for a while. So slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. And in 1891, there was a legal institution of separation of schools, or separate schools, where Black and white or colored and non-colored children were put into separate schools, or at least separate classrooms. And what many people don't know is that in the early 1900s, there was actually legislation in Canada which deemed African Americans, specifically those Blacks coming from America, as unsuitable. So anybody coming from the South who was Black was discouraged from immigrating to Canada because of things like not being suited to the climate. And that was just a federally mandated way to keep Black people out of Canada, which is fairly interesting and not a fact that many people know. The Fair Employment Act was instituted in 1953 by the federal government. It was the first of its kind to speak against discrimination for ethnicity, race, creed, religion. And throughout the 60s, segregated schools slowly closed, with the exception of one school in Nova Scotia that was closed in the 70s. Human rights continued to be expanded into the 1970s with the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was prohibiting segregation and discrimination on the basis of a number of identities. And the following year, a voluntary affirmative action program was then instituted by the federal government, which was meant to encourage employers to increase representation of different people in the workplace. However, a few years later, about 6 or 7 years later, the Abella report came out. So this was Judge Rosalie Abella, who wrote a commission describing the failures of this voluntary affirmative action program to increase adequately underrepresentation of oppressed groups. And so that in her report, she actually was the first to use the term equity and employment equity, and had said that, you know, whatever was being done was not enough and more had to be done. And a few years later, the federal contractors program was instituted. So essentially anybody who was receiving $200,000 or more from the federal government in contracts, so whether that be for universities or other research or institutions, these organizations would have to report on who they were hiring and report on equity. And that didn't go very far, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, because up until now, there are still Canadian universities which are reporting on, at the faculty level, incidences of racism and discrimination and exclusion. So the threshold was raised in 2013 from 200,000 to 1 million, I guess to match inflation, but also I think to decrease the level of accountability, if I'm honest. I'm also pretty sure that there was no requirement for universities to actually report formally to the government on how they were using their funds. And so in 2003, I believe, 8 academics had brought a challenge to the commission, the Human Rights Commission, saying that the Canada Research Chairs program was not inclusive and it was not diverse. And eventually this complaint went to a court order, which resulted in the NSERC CRC action plan. So NSERC, being the Natural Sciences Engineering Research Council of Canada, formally acknowledged that whatever we're doing is not working, and equity, diversity, inclusion was not being reflected in sciences and not in the best and brightest minds of those scientists, which is what the CRC Cheers program is meant to capture, innovation and brilliance across Canada. And so just a few years ago, the CRC action plan was implemented, and any university which receives funding for CRCs is meant to report and be transparent about how they are issuing these funds. And from that, the Dimensions Charter, which is another voluntary charter which universities can subscribe to, was kind of produced at the same time. And it has a list of stipulations for universities which subscribe to this charter to say, these are the things that we're doing to increase representation in our schools. So I know I said that was brief. I hope you're not sleeping, but context does matter to show that in the last 5 years, even till now, we're still trying to make sense of why there has not been change in the representation. And there are many studies which demonstrate that diversity leads to innovation, such as this one by Hofstra et al., which, spare you the details, but the more diversity you have, the more new ideas you have. And that is not a surprise to anyone. But even as recently as a few weeks ago, we have prominent university professors such as Jordan Peterson out of the University of Toronto, who is claiming to retire because of what you see here, the appalling ideology of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which apparently is demolishing education and business. And so I'm not going to give any more credence to this other than to say that people still don't believe it's a thing. People still think that affirmative action or equity efforts are taking away from good talent, and it's just not the case. And so this brings us to the discussion of the leaky pipeline. So what exactly is it? It's essentially the progressive loss of Black talent on their pursuit of careers in STEM. And so this is my lovely attempt at a schematic of a pipeline where at the left-hand side, we have our talented Black prospects coming in through undergraduate, and this stream of talent decreasing as we get to the highest levels of professoriate. And so the question is, how can we use the systematic approach, to increase the number of Black scientists in STEM? And so while the leaky pipeline typically focuses on undergrad to tenureship, it actually starts beforehand. And that's where I want to start talking about today. I want to think about how we can decrease the loss of Black professionals from the earliest stages. And so why not use the scientific method, which we're all familiar with? It feels silly to say, but up until this point, data has not been collected and universities are kind of scrambling to do this. So wouldn't it make sense to observe what's happening, introduce interventions, analyze what the interventions have done, assess and report on that information, and then do it all again? That is the scientific method. And it would make the most sense to use this approach to see how we're all doing if we claim to be diverse and inclusive institutions. And so, as I mentioned before, I think that it starts prior to undergraduate. I think that it starts, and I know that it starts from the primary school area. So what we'll do in the next few slides is a series of talking about what we know and what we don't know in terms of the leaky pipeline. So consider what we know to be previous research and observations as per the scientific method. What we don't know, research questions, which we'll get into for subsequent stages. So StatsCan has done some work with respect to obviously accounting for demographics as the federal agency who does that. And so there is some information about demographics of the population generally. And so this information comes from the report in 2016. It was a general social survey. And so what you're looking at is the percent of the population, males on the left-hand side and females on the right-hand side. And we're looking at the age of those populations. So the Black population is shown in gold and the total population is shown in blue. And so if you just take a look, you can essentially see that the base of the gold scheme is heaviest at the bottom, which shows us that the Black population is young. Most of the Black population in Canada is quite young. And in fact, in 2016, the average or the median age was just under 30, as opposed to just over 40 for the general population. And more than that, those youth under 15 years old were just over a quarter of the Black population. So our population is growing, which is important to know for future talent and future Black scientists. And so what was interesting was looking at the way that Black children in this survey saw themselves. So in this figure, you're looking at the percent of respondents on the y-axis and the Black population again in gold with the non-Black population in blue. And so we're looking at two survey questions on the left and right. Would you like a degree? And do you think you can obtain a degree? And while most Black children admitted that they would like a degree, so 94%, statistically significant 94%. About a third of those same youth, not children, didn't believe that they could receive that degree. And so while the difference between the Black population and the general population who believed that they could get a degree was not statistically significant, it is interesting to see how that changed and how that changes even in the same moment of time. So there has been some work done by numerous social scientists in Canadian universities, including Dr. Carl James out of York University, which looks into how Black children and Black students are perceived, specifically in this publication, talking about students who are deemed as at risk and those stereotypes which feed into that categorization by teachers and other school professionals. And so stereotypes such as Black boys are troublemakers, they're fatherless, they're athletes, they can't achieve. These 4 or 5 stereotypes do play into the psyche of how Black boys do well in school, but also how they are streamed out or removed from programs and are not allowed to achieve what they could otherwise. So this report coming out of Toronto in 2017 talks about that streaming process. So in Ontario, there were 2 streams, applied and academic, where the former was meant to direct students to college and trades programs, and the academic was meant to direct students to universities and professional programs. And the report says that their Black students were generally pushed or encouraged into the applied programs, and as opposed to their counterparts, and also the impact of this of the stereotypes for Black boys and how they were suspended and expelled at higher rates than other counterparts. And so research can have an impact. And it was just a few years ago that streaming was removed, to my knowledge, from the Ontario system, or perhaps is in phase of being removed. And it'll be interesting to see what impact that has for Black students. So what about other points of entry for Black students? Community programming is quite important. And programs such as this, the Elite Black Youth Program, which is being headed and led by Dr. Andre McDonald at the University of Alberta, are directed to bringing students in at a very young age to let them know that these opportunities are for them and they're accessible. And so the Elite program is one such program out of Alberta, but there's also things all across the country. This example for a science camp, which was being sponsored by the University of Waterloo, gave free spots or gives free spots to students or to kids to show them fun experiments that they can do in the summer to kind of get them into the idea of, science can be fun. It's not just for nerds. I mean, maybe it is for nerds, but nerds are cool, and why not encourage them from a young age to participate? And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Canadian Black Scientists Network also has a mentorship program, which is meant to connect early career scientists and youth to those further in the career to build a community. And I think that community is so important to ensuring that we're bringing in and supporting Black talent at all stages. So what does this mean? What do we want to know moving forward about recruitment of young talent? And so I would love for someone to tell me if elementary and high school teachers are continuing to expel Black students at disproportionate rates. How about the de-streaming program? Does this have an impact on how many Black students are applying to grad school or to undergrad to undergrad, and finally, how do after school or mentorship programs, what is the impact of encouraging those students to come into STEM fields? Can we quantify that and measure that to see if this is having an effect? So getting back to the leaky pipeline, let's move on to a higher stage. So that's looking at undergrad to your PhD. So this book, they said this would be fun, written by Eternity Martise, talks about the experience of one student, herself, it's a memoir, as an undergraduate at a Canadian university. Interestingly enough, I went to the same university, that's Western in London, Ontario. We were there at the same time, didn't overlap, but when I read the story, it was so interesting and so in some ways devastating how familiar a lot of what she talked about was. And so the feelings of being out of place, of feeling like eyes are on you all the time, feeling disconnected from people on campus, even things like when you're crossing the street and you see another Black student and they pass you without locking eyes, and analyzing what that means. All of these experiences were things that Eternity describes in her book, and things that are familiar to me. So sexism, racism, and social isolation of Black students, at least up until 2013, were very predominant. And these are the types of barriers that remove Black talent, remove students from the pool. And while Eternity was studying a English degree or an arts degree, the same applies for sciences. In fact, it might be more difficult in the sciences where there are fewer Black students. And so I would encourage you to pick this up. But the take-home message being that these experiences are part of what removes students at earlier stages. So interestingly enough, as we know, there are both formal and informal methods to prohibiting entry of talent. And one interesting study looks at what happens when women and minorities email prospective researchers to join their group or to join their research, and what the difference is between white males and visible minorities or females. And so visible minorities being those people who are non-white, and this study was out of the US. So I remade this image, just pulling out the different disciplines. And what you're seeing is the disciplines which are relevant to STEM. So that's natural sciences, life sciences, health sciences, and engineering. And the discriminatory gap. So what that is the difference in percentage of the responding, of correspondence, I should say, between white males and women and visible minorities. And so what you'll understand is that essentially the values are always positive. So it means all to say that white males often will receive a stronger or a higher response rate than women or visible minorities, even if the email reads the same way. So this research was done with over 6,000 fake emails with the names which were meant to be coded to different racial groups, and that was verified prior to running the audit. And it was interesting because the facts were that even if there's no real difference into how the flow of the email went, just having a name that signals to somebody that you're not from the dominant group can decrease your chance of being connected to prospective research opportunities. And so systemic, when we talk about systemic, this is one of the ways. And so questions that I'd have, questions that you should be asking yourself, how many students in undergrad are even exposed to research, and what is the rate of successful entry into graduate school even before they've actually applied directly to the school and contacting professors? How successful is that? Once Black students get into graduate school, do they complete graduate school, and at what rates? How many receive scholarships? Money is an important thing, obviously, and many Black students often have to work jobs outside of TA-ships to be able to go to grad school. And finally, how many Black students have published within their graduate career? And that, of course, is important because as you advance in the career, publications are the currency. And the more publications you have, the more successful generally, at least in academia, you will be. So let's transition to the higher levels of the professoriate. So going from postdoc to a tenured professor. So the truth is, in Canada, there isn't much information. I probably have harped on this a few times already, but demographic data collection has generally been avoided. And I think that's for a number of reasons. Canada likes to call itself a diverse country, and I think generally we are. StatCan will show us that. But if we look at universities as an example, how diverse are we actually? And so this book, The Equity Myth, which was written by Francis Henry and other social scientists in Canada, is one of the only books to look at the experience of Black faculty across Canada. And the studies were done over several years. And so the next couple of figures are just pulling out some of that research. It's mainly qualitative research, but it's the only research, to my knowledge, that exists so far in the absence of formal demographic data collection. So many of the respondents were from STEM. So what you're looking at here, the different disciplines, again, on the y-axis, and the difference between racialized and non-racialized professors in each discipline. So essentially, if we just, if we just focus on the right-hand side, this shows us the number of faculty respondents that were in the majority that were racialized compared to non-racialized. So these will be shown on the right-hand side of that middle axis there. And interestingly enough, there was a significant difference in those professors in the social sciences, in medicine and dentistry, and in business. Maybe not surprisingly, there was more non-racialized or white faculty in things like computer sciences, health sciences, and other. And so this came from a survey where over 2,000 participants were included. And so I thought that was interesting to share because, I mean, it's the only information that we have. Other professional outcomes. So it takes, or at that time at least took, about 3 years longer for racialized professors to receive tenure and to become full professor, I should say. And so this, again, looking at the difference between racialized and non-racialized, and you can see all of these values are negative, demonstrating that there was a difference and a negative difference between the outcomes of racialized professors, and that includes Black professors as well. So, and the time that it took to get to full professor was statistically different. So what about money? Let's talk about the earnings gap. So while there was some talk about this in the book, The Equity Myth, I'm just pulling out here a report from 2018 from the Canadian Canadian Association of University Teachers, which actually did do a survey to look at the different racialized groups and talking about the difference in pay. And essentially, there's a 14% difference between Black teachers and other teachers in earnings, at least at that time. And similar values were estimated or approximated from the equity myth. So a lot of stats here. I'm hoping I'm not boring you all to death, but just showing you that there are, despite the lack of research that's been done, there are a number of indicators that are showing why there are differences in achievement and why there's this leaky pipeline. And of course, I am not a professor, but there's that description of what that experience is like to be the only Black professor, to be the only Black postdoc or faculty, being both extremely visible because you're often the only one or one of few, and also invisible because perhaps you're not being addressed or getting accolades for the work that you do while you're being overburdened with mentorship and other types of service work, and what that does to your tenure application. I mean, I can't comment to it, but I know that generally in the sciences, publications are viewed in a more valuable way than service. So all of these things contribute to why there are a variety of systemic issues which prevent the entry of Black talent into the sciences and STEM in general. So these are questions related to that top level of the professoriate. what would it look like, and how different would universities look if service was weighted differently, if service was valued differently. I want to know, how long do Black faculty stay at universities and why they leave? There's been lots of talk of training and unconscious bias and anti-racism training. Will that actually change the way that Black faculty experience universities? And with cohort hires being a thing now, how does the university actually prepare its current employees to receive a cohort of Black faculty and to welcome them? And finally, are departmental workloads being equitably distributed? These are all questions that I'd like to know. I don't know the answers yet, but hopefully over time we'll begin to learn more about this as a society. So those are the stats. Hopefully you're all awake still, not asleep. I'm almost done here. But while there's a lot we don't know, there are a few good things which we can point to, which give us hope. One thing that will force our universities to, I think, change the way that we operate is that international student enrollment is increasing. In this graph, we're looking at the number of study permit holders from 2000 to 2020, and we see that there is a steady increase in the amount of international students coming to Canada. And more than that, the majority of these study permit holders are coming from the global south. So places like India and China, but also places like Nigeria and Iran. And so if our student population is changing, what are we doing as a fact to accommodate and welcome and ensure that these students are supported and successful? Data is being collected, which is so exciting for me and hopefully exciting for you. U of T, for example, launched its census, I believe it was last year, if I'm not mistaken. And this is just an image snapshot really showing the type of questions which are meant to address and finally answer who's on campus. It's kind of ridiculous to believe that universities don't know that yet, but I mean, we're starting somewhere, and so I'm happy to see that a racial and ethno-cultural identity is finally being assessed across universities in Canada, including the U of T. Cluster hires. So bulk hires of Black faculty have started in different institutions in Canada. Some examples of this have been seen in the University of Alberta, at Waterloo, and McMaster University. I also know that there's at least one institution in Nova Scotia which is doing the same. And so this, I think, is great. I mean, I know it's not a blanket resolution to the challenges that we're facing, but it's huge and it's a start. So I'm pretty excited about this. More than that, equity offices are now being included or are now being created in universities. And I want to be hopeful that this is something that will keep universities accountable. But in early stages, we've yet to see what this means. What does give me hope is wonderful and brilliant Black women at the head of many of these equity offices. So Dr. Gilpin Jackson, Dr. Melinda Smith, and Denise O'Neill Green at various institutions across the country, literally overseeing this work. And I'm hoping not being overburdened with the work, being supported by their universities. And of course, the Scarborough Charter, there are people in this room who have worked towards creating this document. In 2020, a large conference of scientists, social scientists, academics, Black academics from across the country talking about what is needed for the inclusion of Black people at Canadian higher education institutions. And the charter was signed finally in this past November. And so this is just a screenshot taken from the website showing all of the signatories. So these are universities who are saying that they agree that something needs to be done and that they're going to be working towards ensuring that they're accountable for including more Black faculty and students within their doors. So it is a success, and we'll see how how that looks and what that means in the future, especially with respect to the 3 R's. So of course, recruitment, retention, and representation. This is one of the mantras of equity, and I would hope, and I do think that the Scarborough Charter is one of the things that'll help to ensure that these initiatives lead to successful outcomes for Black academics in general, but for Black scientists specifically. And so approaching known unknowns in EDI, I've kind of rambled a bit, but trying to show us that there is a way to question the system that we're a part of. And so I took a course, an equity data bootcamp in October, which talked about the way to think about a project involving demographic data and to start from things like where money is coming in, who wants the information, and how it's going to be used. And so while it is a very complicated system and a complicated effort, I think that there are scientific ways to look at this work, specifically in looking at the data collection and analysis. I think that people like myself who are trained formally in rigorous approaches can question the system and bring to light some information which can help society and Black people on the whole. And so the last question, or one of the last questions, are how will we know it's working? And I don't know if there's any short answer to that, quite honestly. I think that is getting to the things that we don't know. One response you'll often hear is, when we're not talking about this anymore. I think that, for me, I'd like to see the BESTEMM conference be successful for many decades. And I think that might be one outcome which demonstrates that things are changing for the better. So it's a complicated system. I've tried to do my best to walk us through the different ways that things are intentionally designed to keep success out. And hopefully in the next several years, we start to see and uncover real ways that we can change this for Black students and faculty. And so equity is a path function, said no one ever. I said this because that's my nerdy way to describe that it's a journey. It's not direct. There are state functions and path functions in chemistry and sciences. And I think that the work that I'm trying to take on now is not a state function. It is, like my talk, meandering and confusing and frustrating, but I think ultimately it is a journey worth taking. And I hope that in my postdoc and in successive work, that it'll lead to some outcomes which will lead for more people who look like me in the places that they need to be. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. This is a short poem that I wrote in my thesis dedicating to future Black scientists. So I'll just read it out loud here for those yet to come. This is your time. You are brilliant. You are Black. You are beautiful, and the world needs you. And love yourself and shine for all to see. And this is something that I try to remind myself, especially in hard days of these times. And so I thank you all for listening, and I'm ready to take questions. Hopefully you're not all sleeping. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asiedu. I just took a peek at the chat box on the website, and I can assure you everyone's wide awake. Everyone is riveted by your really fascinating talk.
Okay.
Thank you for describing your transition from your research in the physical sciences going into the social sciences too, to get at, I guess, the research kind of backing into your own experiences and how that might have been impacted by the massive deficits in academia.
Yeah. Yes.
So thank you for working to fix that and for just talking about it so eloquently. So I do have lots of questions for you, so I'll try to squeeze in what we can. We're at the end of this end of the session. So we have a question here. I'll just quote it. It's a comment and question. So thank you for reviewing these data so clearly, Dr. Asiedu, and showing that these experiences are not just anecdotes. I am always shocked by how many administrators and professors don't know these data or assume they actually show that Blacks are inferior rather than showing that Blacks are excluded. Can you share how you discuss these patterns with people while making it clear how to distinguish between cause and effect?
Great question. And I want to apologize to everybody that I just realized I took all the question time. I'm so sorry. The short answer is I have yet to have enough conversations about this, but that is why context is important. It's not about inferiority. It's a historical and intentional design of the system meant to create that gap when we're talking about having schools that are separate, and we're talking about ensuring that the right people are let into Canada or not. And also when we value things such as, I don't know, volunteering in a hospital versus volunteering in a church, we value them differently. These are the things that produce gaps in achievement. And it's, race has been described and is known to be kind of a social construct. And so if we can all get on the same page about that, a lot of these conversations will be easier, but part of it is that it is not talked about enough. So hopefully we start to have these conversations more, and it's not a surprise for people to learn that some of the things I've discussed here today. So thanks for your question.
I'll squeeze in one more question. So in the current ongoing Black cluster hiring, I'm puzzled as to why some institutions define the research areas for the positions narrowly. For example, the applicant must do research in racism or business model in developing countries and so on. Why not open the research options for other positions? Is that something that you see as well?
I haven't. I'll admit I haven't seen that, but I'm sure that this person has what they're seeing is true. I can't speak to it directly. It might be a matter of the fact that these institutions see a gap in what they hope to study, but I also think it's another part of the systemic flaws that we see in Canada, pigeonholing certain professionals into the types of work that they can do. Of course, limits the amount of people who can apply, which makes it that much more difficult. So I can't speak to exactly why that happens. I can say that that's not the case everywhere. I don't believe that at McMaster, for example, had such narrow definitions for the roles. And the U of A kind of ascribed one hire per discipline. So one for engineering, one for the sciences, for example, and so on and so forth. So that's not always the case, which is good. That's what I'd say.
Okay. Well, maybe there's some heterogeneity in how these things are applied across the system.
Absolutely.
Before I let you go, I had you gave us a lot of questions that you're planning to research, and someone dropped in an extra question for you.
Okay.
So I just want to read it out to you. So perhaps another question is, how many Black undergraduates opt not to continue into grad school, and why? So part of that leaky pipeline you were describing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like I can think of a million reasons, but
I know. Yeah. Read attorney's book, right? Yeah. There's a number of reasons for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just wrap up, and thank you so much for that excellent talk again. I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping notes for our audience, but that was such an incredible presentation. Thank you for sharing with us your research, your entire career journey, your path, and also giving us some homework, some reading material, the equity myth. I just want to highlight that Dr. Melinda Smith, who's one of the co-authors and who you mentioned as well as part of the University of Calgary, she'll be giving the opening remarks on February 2nd. So something to look forward to in the conference for everyone. So with that, I'm going to just remind us what we have coming up next in the conference. So that we're at the end of our morning keynote session, but don't worry, we have lots more to offer you today. You can join us back here live at the plenary stage at 3 p.m. Eastern Time for our Black Health, Equity, and Curriculum session, which features Dr. Denise Lewis and Dr. Gaynor Watson-Creed. Next, you're also invited to join the CBSN Mentorship Program Social, which is also at 3 p.m., hosted by Drs. Jude Kong and Eric Lucom. And finally, after the break, we have lots of talks and programs to keep you busy. If you navigate to the Sessions tab on the BESTEMM website, you can find your way to the Science Fair, where projects are available for viewing all day. You can also view the posters and pre-recorded poster presentations in anticipation of a live poster Q&A, which is happening tomorrow. And in addition, yeah, so the slide's up here now. In addition, we also have another round of 5 concurrent sessions from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern time, which features live Q&As with the speakers. That's where I'll be running over after this to chair another session. And last but not least, if you navigate to the Get Connected tab on the website, you can also access the career fair, which has been set up for all of our conference registrants to explore careers, find opportunities, and meet future employers and build your network. And with that, I would like to once again thank our 2 keynote speakers for the day, Dr. Jude Kong and Dr. Evelyn Asiedu. Thank you all for joining. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Take advantage of all that the conference has to offer you. We have lots happening under the session and the Get Connected tabs on the website, and I hope to see you all soon.